Good morning, Plainview. I did put that sign-in sheet in there. Oh, okay, I see it. Last class, we were talking about the westward movement, and we kind of talked our way through California. We were getting ready to talk about Oregon Territory. Oh, by the way, happy birthday, Marine Corps. That's a good question for your next exam. What is the birthday of the United States Marine Corps? See, last time we worked our way through Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, all that. One thing to remember about John Tyler is some of the things that he did legislative-wise. He claimed to be against slavery, but he was a slave owner. He was in favor of gradual emancipation of the slaves. He was in favor of bringing new territories into the United States. Wasn't very successful in doing it. He eventually became in favor of bringing Texas, the Republic of Texas, in the United States, and we'll talk about Texas. He didn't get much of that done. He vetoed he got the Independent Treasury Act repealed. He vetoed the Banking Act. He was also the first president to ever have his veto overridden. I can't even remember the bill. It was an insignificant little bill that he vetoed, and Congress got the 2/3 vote required and overrode his veto. First time in our history that had happened. The other first is, he's the first vice president ever to become president because the president died or left office. And life was pretty tough for him in that respect because a lot of people didn't consider him to be the president, especially people that didn't like him, refused to recognize him as president. And we talked about that a little bit last time, but it was pretty tough. And eventually the Senate and everyone's going to have to recognize him as president, and they give up on all their complaining. The other case, I think I talked about the Creole case, the ship full of slaves that went to the Bahamas on vacation, thereby becoming free men because there was no slavery allowed in the Bahamas. That caused a chilling between us and the British, again. And also going on through all these presidents, from Jackson to Martin Van Buren, Harrison and Tyler, we were fighting down in Florida, fighting the Seminoles. And for the large part, we were the ones that were doing all the dying and losing of battles, because the Seminoles were fighting in their home country in the swamps and places like that. And we weren't very good at that. Eventually, we'll kind of overpower them. And in 1843, while Tyler is president, will finally move most of them either out to reservations west of the Mississippi or to the one reservation that was organized for them in Florida itself. And most of the violence died out after that. We talked about Webster Ashburton, we don't need to repeat that. Manifest Destiny, Mexican War of Independence, Mexican Empire. We talked about Texas Revolution, and the fact that by 1836, when Texas won its independence, even though the people of Mexico City disagreed with that, they wanted to become part of the United States. Andrew Jackson wouldn't let them in. Martin Van Buren wouldn't let them in. John Tyler eventually will let them in, but he wanted to do it much earlier and wasn't able to push it through Congress. He had a lot of opponents in the Senate, and they blocked it. Why did they block it? Why did most people not want Texas to come into the Union? It's not most people, but why did most of the leaders not want Texas in the Union? Yeah, slavery was the issue. Again, just like back in the Missouri Compromise, the balance between slave states and anti-slave states. And people were afraid either the north of the U.S. and the south of the U.S. would get in a fight, or the U.S. would get in a fight with Mexico, and then a lot of people didn't want to get in either one of those fights. Be that as it may, we talked about California. We talked about kind of the late arrival of the Spanish in California. They'd settled all their other American colonies in the 1500s, but they won't go up to California until they suddenly realize the Russians are interested in it and the British are interested in it, and they need to get their feet on the ground so that those countries won't get that land. And that's when they send Junipero Serra and his missionaries up there, and some Spanish army as well. We talked about the missions, I think, enough. And the fact that eventually the Franciscans caused so much trouble with the Indians that the government down in Mexico City is going to tell them all to come home and leave the army in charge. And they set up a string of forts along the coast. San Diego, Monterey, San Francisco, Santa Barbara. And I think I mentioned this too, the gold rush. Didn't happen until much later. It happened in 1848. Gold was discovered in John Augustus Sutter's land grant. I think it was over by, he was building a grist mill to grind wheat, and they discovered gold. That brought the big gold rush of 1849, and it changes the whole balance in California, ethnic balance, because up until that time, the majority of people there, maybe 8,000 people we call Californios, in other words, people of Hispanic origin. Now they're Mexicans rather than Spanish. A lot of them living on large land grants and things like that. When the gold rush starts, they're overwhelmed by hundreds of thousands of people, and so the ethnic balance totally changes. Now let's talk about Oregon country. There it is. Remember when we had the Anglo-American Convention of 1818, we decided on a border along 49 degrees north, but it didn't go past the Rocky Mountains. And the reason for it was that the Russians, the Americans, the U.S. people, that is, the Americans and the British all were interested in that territory. The earliest interest was fur. Big, big money in it, especially the further north you got. Later on, a lot of Americans are going to become interested in it for farmland. If you look at this map, down low on the map there is the Willamette River Valley. Kind of, the river runs almost parallel to the coast. Beautiful land, easily accessible, and people that are suffering from the Depression of 1837 are going to flock to that place. That whole territory, called Oregon Territory, includes a lot. Lewis and Clark got out there. They were some of the first Europeans there. The Spanish had been by on ships, but they really hadn't landed and stayed anywhere. San Francisco didn't exist as a city, although there was a Presidio of San Francisco. Lewis and Clark got there, then the British Hudson Bay Company sent a branch out there, set up a fur trading outpost in 1811 called the British Northwest Company. Same year, a wealthy American businessman, John Jacob Astor, set up an outpost, a trading outpost, fur company. He had the Pacific Fur Company. In the 20s and 30s, the area is dominated mainly by the Hudson's Bay Company because it was the biggest fur trading company in the world. And so even the Americans, the people that came from the U.S. out there, they depend on the Hudson Bay Company for their supplies and all of that. Starting in the 30s, especially after we have our economic crush at the end of the 30s in 1837, American settlers and missionaries are going to start coming out there in larger and larger numbers. Way back when John Jacob Astor set up his outpost there, he actually paid some people to blaze a trail across the Rocky Mountains so you could get to the West Coast overland. But not many people used that trail. It was pretty hazardous. And there were people that didn't like you along that trail, such as Indians and people like that. So they didn't use it as much as they used the sea route, just going from the east coast of the U.S. all the way down around South America and back up. That could be a pretty hazardous trip too. But that's how Astor transported his fur. When you get up to the 40s though, we're interested in the Republic of Texas, and we're interested in this Oregon Territory. And when we get into a war with Mexico over the Republic of Texas, the British are going to take a look at that and say, these crazy Americans will fight for anything. And so it's going to be easier to negotiate with them. And we split our interests at the 49th parallel. So that border that started at the Lake of the Woods now goes all the way across the Rockies and out to the Pacific almost, along 49 degrees. By that time, by the way, the Russians had bowed out of the picture. They said, we don't want anything south of 5440. They signed a treaty with us, they signed a treaty with the British. And if you add those two treaties together, it meant Russians out except north of 5440. There were a lot of sloganeers wanting us to take that whole territory. And you saw these slogans on wagons and things like that, 5440 or bust and things like that. But in terms of practicality, we really didn't want it that far north anyway. And so we're going to sign a treaty with the Brits in 1846. And then Oregon's going to become an official U.S. territory. At first, it's unofficial. They set up their own local government and all that, so they can organize into a territory. Remember the rules you have to go through to get to become a state. So they start that way. Let's talk about that a little bit. Well, these are three of the first people to invest out there. Way back, 1811, John Jacob Astor was into it. But the people going west, not just to Oregon Territory, but also to where Colorado is now and some of those intermediary places, they all went west. The first big reason was millions of dollars to be made in fur. John Jacob Astor sets up an outpost out there. He's got a big shipping company. He even does business with China. He owns three different fur companies: the American Fur Company, the Pacific Fur Company, and the Southwest Fur Company. Some of his fur he takes from Oregon country, some of from the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains. So some of it goes out off the west coast and onto ships. Some of it goes down the Missouri River, back to St. Joe and St. Joseph and St. Louis. Probably the first of them, though, was Manuel Lisa. He was, I think, born in New Orleans, and he was a trapper and spent winter seasons up in the mountains of the Rockies on the eastern slope, and carried his fur at first all the way down to New Orleans, and that got to be too much of a trip and cost too much, and it was too dangerous. So he moved his headquarters up to St. Louis, and got other people to do the trapping for him instead of doing it for himself, and organizes the Missouri Fur Company. And I think that was really early. That was before people were interested in Oregon, really, about 1808. So he's the first big fur millionaire in America. John Jacob Astor was a millionaire for all sorts of trade. He even imported opium from China. Back then it was legal. William Ashley came a little bit later. He organized the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. He did an interesting thing. All of them, when you get to be a millionaire, you're always thinking about efficiency, how to make it cheaper, how to lower the overhead so you make more profit. And the thing was, if you trapped animals for fur, you wanted to trap them in the fall when they had the best fur. Then the winter would come on and you wouldn't be able to get out of the mountains to sell. So these trappers would have to spend the whole winter in dugouts and whatever they had up in the mountains, usually by themselves. Can you imagine, just being, and a lot of the time snowed in, so they can't go anywhere, hoping that their supplies last long enough. They probably really looked like hell after the winter was over. Nobody to help them shave or anything like that, so they looked like creatures. And then they would come down to the mountains, and then they'd have to have this long trip all the way down the Missouri River. It was too far, and sometimes they'd miss a whole year of trapping before they could get back up there. And what William Henry Ashley did was, told them, don't come to me, I'll come to you. And he started setting up these, like a wagon train or mule trains and things, and they would come up along the foothills of the eastern slope of the Rockies, and every year they'd pass the word, we will get together, we will rendezvous at such and such a place. Bring your fur down there, you don't have to go anywhere. I'll give you all the supplies you need, everything like that, go back to trapping. Saved money for everybody, made a lot of money for William Ashley. They called it the rendezvous system, the Rocky Mountain rendezvous system. He wasn't the only guy that did it. Everybody that did it that bought fur on the eastern slope did it. They were pretty wild. These rendezvous were really wild. Can you imagine a guy being locked up for about 4 or 5 months by himself in a cave, coming out of that cave and going, woo-hoo, seeing the first human beings he's seen for a long, long time. Might even be some girls on those wagon groups. Might even be some whiskey. There was a lot of noise, celebration, and they were getting cash money for it. Pretty wild. A lot of stories came out of that. Eventually, what you're going to see are different trails going out into Oregon country. One called the California Trail that splits off from the Oregon Trail. I think the first big trail was the Oregon Trail, pretty much along the lines that John Jacob Astor had blazed for him. Later years, the Mormon Trail would go out that way. Also some trails that didn't go that far but went to places like Santa Fe and Nuevo Mexico. There's another map of the Oregon Trail. You notice it's leaving Independence, Missouri, kind of following the Lewis and Clark route all the way out to the west coast. Some of the next people to go, people like Marcus Whitman. He was a doctor, but he was also a missionary. Jason Lee was an Episcopalian preacher. Henry Spalding was a Presbyterian. They go out there and set up little colonies, mainly amongst farmers. They promote farming and that sort of thing. So they're not just ministers, they're also entrepreneurs about land and crops and things like that. There'll be a lot of wars over territory and that sort of thing. And eventually, they're going to stop buying their supplies from the Hudson Bay Company and start producing some of their own supplies. They go down south into Mexican territory, and they buy cattle down there, and they start growing cattle up in the Oregon territory. Eventually, they'll put together their own government. First, they're not official, but eventually they become an official U.S. territory. after we reached a treaty with the British. Andrew Jackson had sent guys out there to go out, look at it, report back to him about, was there anything of any value there? And one of the reports he got was they're dependent on the Hudson Bay Company for their supplies. If we could fix that, we might be able to get control of that area. They'll become an official territory of the U.S. in 1848 after we reached a treaty with the British. It's a huge territory. Present-day states of Idaho, Oregon, Washington, parts of Montana, and parts of Wyoming all were included in the Oregon territory. It went all the way up to 54, or all the way up to 49 degrees, and it went all the way down to the Adams-Onis line at 42 degrees. Eventually, they're going to break that up. The first big breakup will happen in the 1853. They'll break off the northern part of that. That will become Washington territory. And eventually, you'll get the other territories chipped off the eastern side of it. Why are we doing all this? Well, the initial motivation, fur. The next motivation is land and opportunity, especially when we have these different economic downturns. People are out looking for cheap land, a way to make a fresh start. Even in 1819, people were going there. But after 1837, they went there in really large numbers. We were competing with the Brits. We were competing with the Spanish. Eventually, we'll get it all. Okay. Now we're going to elect President Polk. How did that happen? The Democrats' obvious contender for the presidency was Martin Van Buren. He'd been elected president once. He was a pretty popular guy. People respected him as president. But he had a problem. And his problem was he was one of those guys that thought Texas shouldn't be brought into the Union because of the problems it would cause. And the majority of his party tended to favor bringing Texas into the Union. So they finally dumped him. Then they go looking around for another guy that's got a big enough name to get elected. And they really can't find one. So they settle on the guy that used to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He'd been the governor of Tennessee. And the ghost out there in Tennessee that is still there, still alive, and still incredibly popular, Andy Jackson, kind of waved his wand over this guy's head, and his name was James K. Polk. He'll be the Democrats' candidate. The Whigs picked Henry Clay. He didn't like annexation, but he didn't want to talk about it because he thought it lost votes. He didn't want to talk about slavery. He tiptoed around those issues when he was campaigning. The fact that he tiptoed around them made some anti-slavery people angry. They're going to form a new party called the Liberty Party, pro-abolition. That will draw away from votes that Clay might have gotten otherwise. There they are. Clay, the Whig, James K. Polk, the Democrat. Clay's platform, he didn't want to annex Texas. He didn't want to talk about slavery. He wanted to get cozy with the English and figure out how to settle Oregon territory. Didn't want to get into conflict with them. And he wanted a tariff. Now that makes him different from a lot of Southerners because most Southerners don't like tariffs. But remember, Clay's American system supported tariffs. You can see some strikes against him even before he runs. Polk had a really interesting platform. It was kind of dynamic. One of the earliest really dynamic presidential platforms. He promised to reestablish the independent treasury system because we didn't have a bank. He promised to reduce tariffs. And he promised the people that he would acquire all or some of Oregon country. And he would acquire all of California and all of New Mexico from the Mexicans. Didn't explain how he was going to get it. He just said he would. He also promised to support bringing Texas into the Union. He said that would be the first thing he did when he got elected. And finally, he made a really strange promise. He said, if I get all these things done in 4 years, I won't run for re-election. That's an interesting promise to make. There's one other president that's made that promise and really regretted it later on because he could have been re-elected. There he is, 11th President of the U.S. There's his cabinet. Okay. Polk was running to annex Texas. Even before, after he was elected, but before he became president, John Tyler, and I don't know why he did this, I think he supported bringing Texas in, but he'd been trying and trying to get Texas into the Union, and he couldn't get it through the Senate. Texas was raring to go, but he couldn't get it through the Senate. So he decided, instead of doing it by a treaty, which the Senate would have to approve, do it by a joint acclamation of the Congress. In other words, a joint session of Congress, just vote on it. Down and dirty, bring Texas in or not. So that if it wasn't a treaty, then they didn't have to ratify it. And Congress voted in favor of that. And in fact, as soon as they did that, the Mexican government recalled their ambassador from Washington, D.C., because they were not happy. They still didn't recognize Texas. They certainly didn't recognize the border between the Republic of Texas as being the Rio Grande River. So things are going to get nasty pretty fast. John Tyler signs a proposal for statehood. Eventually, Polk is inaugurated. Mexico officially breaks relations with us 2 days after Polk becomes president. Polk sends General Zachary, well, he was a colonel then, Zachary Taylor down to Texas with a force of 1,200 men. That's not very many men. Down in the general area of the Nueces River. You guys know where the rivers are in Texas? See if I get a map. If you look at this map, there's the Brazos, there's the Nueces, there's the Pecos, and there's the Rio Grande. He said, just go down to the Nueces and sit around until you get further orders. Then he sends a diplomat by the name of John Slidell down to Mexico with a secret offer. And he offers them $30 million to settle the Texas border and to sell all or part of California, New Mexico, etc., to the United States. The Mexican government doesn't have a lot of money, and they would really like to have that $30 million bucks. But there were people in the Mexican government that felt this was, an affront to their dignity, etc., etc. One of whom was Santa Anna, who was sometimes in, sometimes out. And what's going to happen is the government starts looking like they're interested in doing the deal. So there's a government overthrow, and that government's kicked out, and a more conservative government comes in and tells our ambassador, forget it. It's a military insurrection. In March of 1846, Mr. Slidell goes back to Washington and says, I can't do it. At this point, Zachary Taylor moves his soldiers down towards the Rio Grande River, crosses the Nueces, goes down to the Rio Grande, sets up a fort opposite Matamoros. He now has over 3,000 men. He sets up outposts along the border. On the 25th of April, 2,000 Mexican soldiers under Anastasio Torreon cross the Rio Grande River, which of course they claim is not the border. and ambushed some U.S. troops at an outpost called Fort Texas. That's the official beginning of the Mexican-American War, I suppose. The President is quickly going to Congress. In your readings, by the way, that I put up for you, there's the President's explanation for why we're going to war, and there's the explanation of the opposing point of view. Those are two things I have in your readings. Take a look at them. They're kind of neat. And really, really different points of view. But we're at war. U.S. troops are going to push the Mexicans back at Palo Alto. General Taylor. It's kind of hard to tell whether he won or not, but since the Mexicans left the area, he can say, I won. He's going to have a whole string of victories like that. Oh, there's Polk's speech. He says the war already started, so you guys might as well go along with it. All of our efforts to avoid it. It's all because of acts by Mexico. We're called upon by every consideration of duty and patriotism to vindicate the honor, the rights, and the interest of our country. And another gentleman stands up in Congress and says, how like the half-insane mumbling of a fever dream is the whole war part of this message. And you'd never guess who that was. Do you recognize him? Without the facial hair. He was a congressman from Illinois at the time. Now, here's the interesting thing. So, according to the President, the nasty Mexicans have attacked us, and we have to fight back for our honor's sake. And this is all, a sudden thing. Strangely enough, we have naval forces off the West Coast. Wonder what they're doing out there. And how long did it take to get there from the East Coast? A long time. We also have naval forces along the eastern coast of Mexico as well. They go as far north as California. We also just happen to have another large Army unit along the border north of where Zachary Taylor is. We have a big concentration of troops up in Missouri, and they're going to set off on a march in the direction of Santa Fe, Nuevo Mexico. All of these things just spontaneously happened after we were attacked? I don't think so. I think it took 2 or 3 months to get ready for that. Maybe more. So, Polk was promising, or planning to keep his promise about getting that territory by hook or by crook. Zachary Taylor goes down south, fights a number of battles, becomes the new darling of the American people, which worries James K. Polk, because Zachary Taylor is a Whig, and Polk's a Democrat. We don't want a Whig becoming the darling of the American people. Eventually, he's going to stop sending more supplies to Zachary Taylor and start giving them to other generals down there. Long story short, let's look at the chronology. We declare war officially on the 14th of May. 1 month later, we attack up in Sonoma, California. A fellow by the name of John T. Fremont, he's related to our Secretary of War, in fact. He declares the Republic of California, the Bear Flag Republic. Doesn't last very long. The next month, a Navy Commodore named John Sloat grabs Monterey, California, and claims all of California for the United States. He also orders John T. Fremont, you're now under my command. John T. Fremont doesn't like that. There's going to be a lifetime fight over that. Less than a month later, Sloat's not in real good health. Less than a month later, a new Commodore, Navy Commodore Robert Stockton, will relieve Sloat. He's going to take Los Angeles. So now we've got Monterey, Los Angeles. This is all June, July, August. It's less than 3 months since this unfortunate attack by the Mexican forces along the Rio Grande. We move into California. Colonel Stephen Kearny is eventually in August going to grab Santa Fe, so now we own New Mexico. He's got a force of about 2,500 men. No resistance. The people up there, they don't care whether they're Mexico or the U.S., because Mexico City doesn't do anything for them anyway. Then Kearny's going to set out with a smaller force and head for California. Eventually, he will become the governor of California, but there will be some battles. Kearny fights a battle called the Battle of San Pascual. I used to live near San Pascual. It's inland from San Diego. They have the San Diego Zoo has its wild animal park out there. It's incredible, the best we have in the U.S. He got surrounded. He only had about 100 men, a little bit more than 100 men left in his force. The rest of them are holding down New Mexico. And some Marines and some Navy guys come ashore to rescue him. In December of 46, Santa Anna is back again, declares himself president of Mexico. By the end of 46, the beginning of 47, all of the Mexican forces in California give up, and we now own California. We now own California. We own, basically by force, we own New Mexico. So the focus of the war is going to shift back into mainland Mexico. Zachary Taylor will win the battle of over Santa Anna at Buena Vista. Winfield Scott, the senior Army officer, is going to land at Veracruz with a force in March. Zachary Taylor will be called home at the end of 47 to rest. The president just doesn't want him becoming a bigger hero than he is. There's a lot of competition between Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, although I think they respected one another. Scott fights his way into Chapultepec. Mexico City surrenders after that fort is taken. There'll be a new government in Mexico. They're going to fire Santa Anna. Actually, it was just a senior general. The government was running things. The new government was running things. In October, at the Battle of Humanita, Santa Anna is defeated again, and now the new Mexican government fires him and takes his army away from him. We pass through Mexico City, trying not to destroy Mexico City. Some other cities were pretty badly beat up. We get to Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the remainder of the Mexican army is holding out. And they surrender at the end of the year, at the end of 1847. And on the 2nd of February 1848, they'll sign a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. You want to remember that one? A ceasefire will be announced in March. The treaty won't be ratified until July. There's a lot of guerrilla fighting going on and that sort of thing, but it's starting to die down. And once the treaty goes into effect, it dies out altogether. We occupy most of Mexico now. And the debate goes on at home before we negotiate this treaty. We want to keep all of Mexico? What do we want? And most people don't want all of Mexico. The president doesn't like the negotiator he sent down there, and he fires him. But the negotiator keeps on negotiating. Actually gets a fairly decent deal with the Mexicans, and reports it back to the president as a done deal, even though he's already been fired. And the president says, well, if it's a done deal, let's get it ratified. Sounds good enough to me, and they get it ratified. The war's over, and we have gained about 400,000 square miles of new territory and about 90,000 new citizens. all of the people of Hispanic origin that lived all through New Mexico, California, and all those places, they were given several alternatives. One was, if you hate the gringos, pack up and go south. The other one was, if you want to keep your land, all your possessions, no one's taking it away from you, you can stay here and become an American citizen. And so basically, we're going to get about 85,000 brand new American citizens just like that. No 5-year waiting period or anything like that. You're on your own land, you can be a citizen. Full rights of citizenship. There were a lot of arguments about that being done too, but we did it. Let's talk about some of the characters involved in this. One was John T. Fremont, the one that set up the Bear Flag Republic. He was famous for being an explorer, but he did let a lot of other people do his exploring for him in large part. He had Kit Carson with him and other people like that. He did some of his own exploring, and it was pretty much a disaster. He was a young military officer. He was an engineer, and he was mapping that Western Territory on behalf of the President of the United States in the late 30s, early 40s. In 1841, he made a very fortunate marriage. He married Senator Thomas Hart Benton's daughter, very influential congressman, member of Congress. That didn't hurt him, and he got all the way up to being a general before the Mexican-American War was over. He'll also be a general at the beginning of the Civil War. He'll also run for president. That's a story for another day. Painting of the Battle of Veracruz. There's what we got. 529,000 square miles, with about 68,000, initially 68,000 Mexican citizens. In the treaty, here's the deal. We get that territory. In return, we give Mexico $15 million, and we indemnify them against any claims by American citizens against what the Mexicans did to them. That's another $3.5 million. In return, we get this giant Mexican cession. Oh, and by the way, while we were in the middle of this, in 1846, we signed the treaty with Britain, splitting Oregon country at 49 degrees. That's when that happened. All happened at the same time. So we get Texas. It's already been annexed anyway. A couple of years later, our surveyors are trying to survey a southern railroad out to the Pacific, and they bump into too many mountains, and they want to go a little bit further south, not very far, but a little bit, down near Gila, Arizona, and places like that. So we approach the Spanish or the Mexican government with another offer. How'd you like to sell that land? We'll give you $10 million, and this time they decide not to go to war, just to take the money. And that's called the Gadsden Purchase. That's made a few presidents in the future. So now the war's over. We're making good progress here. The war's over. Now what are we going to do? We've got all this new territory, plus some leftover territory from Louisiana Territory we haven't made into states or anything. We brought Texas into the Union anyway, but we're going to have to make a deal with Texas. We're going to pass the Texas-New Mexico Act in a while here to settle exactly where their territory is. But we're coming up to 1850. So what did Polk do? He got the independent treasury system going again. He reduced tariffs. He got all of Oregon Territory south of the 49th parallel. He got all of California and all of New Mexico, which also included the territories that became the states of Utah, New Mexico, Nevada. That all was part of that deal. And he reorganized while he was at it the U.S. Navy. It had done some really good work for him off of California and also off the shores of the eastern shores of Mexico during the war. So they're kind of in the favorite guy's chair, and they get a lot of money to build more ships. Okay, let's change to another set of slides. This used to be an enormous 16,000 kilobyte set of slides, and I split it in half. Let's look at our country, how it's developed otherwise. Some of it will be, come on, show up. Okay, there you are. Some of it we know about. Jackson, the elections, all the way up to Tyler. But one thing that we didn't talk about, I talked about our raising population, but I didn't talk about immigration. And something you should notice about immigration was we had massive immigration from two countries in particular, from Ireland and Germany. In Ireland, in the late 1840s, but starting in the mid-1840s, they have a giant potato famine. You have to understand the status of Ireland. They're owned by the English. The landlords are all English people who don't live in Ireland. The farmers are dirt poor. Their major crop in that whole country is potatoes. They have very few rights. There is, in theory, an Irish parliament and all that, but it's run by the English. When the potatoes, there's a potato blight, and it starts killing off their entire potato crop. These people are so poor, they have no source of food. You can go to jail and be deported to a prison island for stealing an ear of corn from some rich farmer. That's how draconian the laws were there. So people start coming out of Ireland. A lot of them head for Scotland, hoping the life's a little bit better there. They're not too happy in Scotland. Some of them marry in Scotland. Now they're Scots-Irish. And they start heading for America. Big, big numbers. We're talking about hundreds of thousands. The potato famine. They lost, like 1 million people in Ireland died from the famine. They lost somewhere over 20% of their total population. That's how desperate they were. And by the way, to afford to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, you didn't get to ride in an ocean liner. It was a really, really bad trip. We'll talk about that somewhere. Well, we can talk about it now. I mean, the trip involved 4 people, and the way they got to ride back to the States was they were riding in cargo ships. They got down and had to live in the cargo hold of that ship all the way across. People got typhus, cholera, dysentery, and they died. In 1 year, almost half of the people that came across died. It was really gruesome. When they get the boat off the boat at the other end, they went for the big cities. They didn't want to do anything having to do with farming anymore. Up in New York, the Democratic Party had this giant political machine called Tammany Hall, and they were saying, "Come on in, we'll give you a place to live, we'll get you a job, just vote Democratic." They were getting massive control of all these people. They controlled their votes for years. We'll talk about Tammany Hall later. Now over in Germany, but just remember, these people all went to the big cities. Boston, New York, some to Baltimore. They didn't want to be farmers anymore. They thought maybe they could get jobs in industry, but they ended up getting the really, really bad jobs because they're the new man on the block. You also saw a new kind of antipathy that's going to start after the Civil War, but even during the Civil War, and that was free black people in the North had the worst of the worst jobs, right? Cleaning up the stockyards and things like that. When these Irish people come over, a lot of them take the jobs away from the black people. And suddenly you have a particular ethnic dislike between Irish immigrants and African Americans. Has nothing to do with the slaves, they're out of the picture. That will flare up from time to time in our history. Germany was part of the Holy Roman Empire, really. There was a whole bunch of little countries in the Holy Roman Empire, and all the aristocrats in Germany were all military men. And the common people were revolting against their aristocrats. It was their democratic movement. But the problem in this case was that their rebellion didn't stand a chance. Because it was the common man against the army, and the army wasn't feeling like in favor of the common man. So when the fighting stops, these people are flooding out of Germany. A lot of them go to England. There's no place for them in England. So they start also flooding into the United States, also in the hundreds of thousands. Not quite as many as there were Irish. Funny thing, revolutions usually start in urban areas, right? All of these people wanted to go to the countryside. Just the opposite of the Irish. The Irish wanted to go to the big cities. The Germans wanted to go to rural areas. Wanted to do things like make beer, make milk, things like that, grow crops. There'll be a lot of them involved in the American Civil War, both Irish and Germans, because that's a really easy job to get during the Civil War. But what it did, it boosted our immigration really, really fast. People up around the manufacturing areas in Boston, they were happy, really happy. Here comes some more, meat for the butcher shop. Let's talk about some other guys that we'll talk about as we go along. Of course, we've talked about John C. Calhoun. I put a before and after picture of him there. That's when he was a young man, when he was vice president, even. And the last picture is when he was in Congress near death in the Senate. Then there's Henry Clay. We talk about him on and off. The great compromiser, the American system. Did the Missouri Compromise, did the nullification crisis, did the Compromise of 1850, and we're about to talk about that. Daniel Webster argued a lot of court cases before the Supreme Court. Was a candidate for president at least once. Tried to get to be a candidate for president several times. Served as Secretary of State several times. Had a golden voice and a golden ability to argue, to debate. His shortcoming was he tended to be short of cash from time to time, and his politics were altered by his need for money. I'm not saying he took bribes, but he went where the money was. Left his ideals behind. Roger B. Taney, remember how he got the job of Chief Justice of the United States? He helped Andrew Jackson take the money out of the National Bank and put it in the pet banks. And when John Marshall dies, Andrew Jackson nominates him to be Chief Justice. We'll be talking about him pretty soon, again. Okay, how about labor in America? We didn't have labor unions. The main reason we didn't have labor unions in the early 1800s was a law about conspiracy. We copied it from the British law about conspiracy. It had a very loose definition, so that if people got together to form a labor union, they could be interpreted as conspiring against their employer. He could go to court about it. Or if, God forbid, they decided, let's go on strike, giant conspiracy. They could be found guilty of conspiracy. They could lose their jobs. They could be fined money, prison sentences, and then they'd be blackballed so they could never get a job again in their chosen industry. But in 1842, and I think it involved shoemakers, cordwainers is what they call them. If you want the literary name for shoemakers, it's cordwainer. There was a strike, and these guys were charged with conspiracy, and they went to the Massachusetts Supreme Court, actually it's the Supreme Justice Court, I think is the name of it. The judge was a guy named Lemuel Shaw. If any of you ever study law, you'll know this guy's name. He never reached the Supreme Court, but everyone studies his decisions, even now. His ruling on this court case was, if you get together and you plan to do something, it's not a conspiracy unless you're planning to do something that's patently illegal. You can't be conspiring to have a picnic. You can't be conspiring to go on strike if you're not doing anything illegal during the strike. This opens the doors for us to start having labor unions. And the only reason we didn't have many strong ones, and I'll show you a few that we did have, was that we're approaching the Civil War and people were occupied with other things. There were a couple groups. The Democratic Party had kind of a labor wing to it, a labor part of the Democratic Party. They called them the Locofocos. And the reason was that finding a meeting place was difficult. And let's say you're in an apartment building and you want to reserve a big room, or in a hotel or whatever, you want to reserve a big room to have a labor meeting. Landlords tended not to like labor. And so if you were in a room having a labor meeting, the landlord would just turn the gas off. So you had no light. Of course, these guys are meeting at night because they have to work in the daytime. There was a kind of kitchen match, the kind you can strike without having to have a special surface, the kind of old cowboys used to just strike by breaking it across our butt, like that. They're called Locofocos. And what they do is they'd strike matches and hold them up so they could see where they were going in these meetings. And the name, someone was making fun of them and started calling them Locofocos, and the name stuck. Another big group that controlled labor, Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine in New York, they controlled the Irish vote, they controlled labor. Sometimes they were like a sub-government. The most powerful government in New York wasn't the real government, it was Tammany Hall. If you want to get a building permit, pay off somebody in Tammany Hall, he'll produce a permit for you. That sort of thing. Lots of corruption. There's Commonwealth versus Hunt. We started seeing professional associations, artisans, people that made things like a craft, craftsmen, mechanics. We didn't early on have mass production in any large numbers. There was a lot of trouble because the South had slaves, and so the labor market wasn't very good. I mean, it was hard to find jobs. Most unions were one specific craft. So you would have a union that were the cigar makers, or you'd have a union that were the shoemakers, the cordwainers. One time they had a typist union when they invented the typewriter. You didn't have any unions that included a lot of different things, like the railroad, for example. They had a union for engineers. They had a union for firemen. You know what a fireman is on a railroad train? Nobody? Nobody knows anymore? The fireman's the guy that had to fuel the train because it ran on coal-fired steam. And so the firemen had their own separate union, not in the engineers' union. And then you had switchmen, so they had a separate union. So there wasn't a giant single union for railways. It was all these different unions. They were pretty small. There weren't many national groups. We had something that called themselves the National Trade Union, but they weren't very powerful. And especially after 1837, when nobody could find a job, most of the unions are going to totally disappear. One that lasted was that National Typographical Union. That's kind of a real specialized thing. That would be like computer geeks of the modern world, I guess. Another thing that's going to influence our time, which starts at the beginning of the 1800s, when Jefferson's still president, is the Great Awakening. It starts out of western New York State. More of the same thing that you got in the first Great Awakening. revivalists, fire and brimstone preachers. Probably the most famous was Charles Grandison Finney. But it all wasn't about Christian religion. There was a general movement coming out of this part of the U.S., a lot of kind of new developments, thinking and things like that. By the way, that red area on there, they called it the burnt over district because of the flames that came from the mouths of the preachers there. That was its nickname. There were a lot of other people that weren't strictly religious, utopians, people like that, who were out in search of the perfect society. One group came out of Western New York, a fellow by the name of Joseph Smith. Some of you probably know who he was. His translation of the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. He's going to become a leader of a really large movement. Initially, they call themselves the Church of Christ. Their book, the Book of Mormon, is not intended to be a Bible. It's an addendum to the Bible. They're going to have followers in Europe. Some of their practices are going to cause people to be uncertain about who these guys are. Do they pose a threat to our Christianity? Do they pose a social threat? Especially when the church starts practicing polygamy. They had a problem because they just didn't have enough members of the church, and they didn't have enough men. So men started being allowed to have more than one wife. That upset a lot of people. I don't know, a bunch of jealous men from other religions or something. I don't know what it was, but it upset people anyway. And they're going to start finding it a little bit hot to settle in any one area. And they're going to start moving around. And they're going to get out into areas like Indiana and Missouri. Kirtland, Ohio, they settled for a while. They have some internal fighting. They start this polygamy up, 1831, and they start calling themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, which they still call themselves. Then they go to Missouri, then they come back to Illinois. They found a town that's going to be their capital maybe. They call it Nauvoo. But they get into fighting. Some of them are very militant and want to fight to defend themselves against people that don't like their church. Some of them just want to get along peaceably. So instead of a fight with outsiders, they start to have an internal fight over that. And of course, external forces are also causing them trouble. In 1844, they're going to have a major split in the church. Their main newspaper is going to be destroyed. Joseph Smith will be arrested because of some violence that occurred. He'll be put in jail. He's going to be assassinated while he's in jail in Carthage, Illinois. From that point on, there's a fight. Who leads the church and what is the church? And there are a lot of splinters which still exist. I don't know the names of all of them. But the mainstream of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints finds a new leader and a fellow by the name of Brigham Young. He's going to have to figure out what to do about the church. They're not very welcome in a lot of places because of the violence. Not that they necessarily cause the violence, but it occurs around them. The Mormon War in 1938 kind of set a bad example. So eventually he's going to look at land way out west, in an area that we will start calling Utah. And they're going to organize almost like military organizations. They organize into companies, and they're going to walk there, company by company, over a period of years, starting in about 1847 and lasting until 1868. And they're going to have a lot of followers coming to them from Europe and other places like that. And they don't have a lot of money. They pool their funds, So they tend to walk. They develop a push cart where you can have some people pull the front and some people pull from the back. They have a push cart song. Maybe I'll play it next class. It's a neat song. And they sang their way out to Utah through a lot of hardships because a lot of places they stopped didn't want them to stop there very long. They'll go all the way from Council Bluffs, Iowa to Fort Bridger in Wyoming. Then the trail cuts down into Utah, down into the Salt Lake area. It's almost the same route as the Oregon Trail and the California Trail. They're going to call their territory Deseret. Now look at the American map and the overlay. That's a lot more than Utah is nowadays. They claim territory even out on the West Coast. Another thing they're going to do, I don't know if I have a mention of it. I don't think I do. I should. During the Mexican-American War, they form a couple of brigades, and they go down and fight on behalf of the United States, which gains them a lot of sympathy. And they're persecuted as time goes on because of their practices and that sort of thing. And they try different ways of concealing the fact that they're practicing polygamy, like keeping wives in a, what is it called? In a sheltered town where there's only women there. You can't figure out why. It's because the men from another town come and visit from time to time. So there's only some really old people and old women and old men to run the place, and it's young women and their children there. And the U.S. government's going to go after them and put immense pressure on them and try and force these second wives into testifying against their husbands and things like that. And it's a really nasty, nasty set of trials and things like that. And it had to be super unpleasant for the women. Eventually that's going to die down, and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is going to say, no more polygamy. Let's keep these people off our backs. Other movements also coming from that area. One of them are people we call the Shakers. Now we've already got the Quakers, right? And then they were named by what they did in church. And the Shakers are too. And they're kind of a Christian group, but not really, and they're really interesting. I'll tell you about the Shakers, and we'll talk about some other groups next class. We're running out of time. The Shakers really shook. When they felt the feeling of God upon them, they shook. They were witnessing God, I guess. But their beliefs were a little bit strange. They had a leader, her name was Ann Lee, and they equated Ann Lee with the second coming of Christ. They were eventually based in Mount Lebanon, Kentucky. God was a dual personality, part Christ and part Mother Ann. Oh, and they also believed in celibacy, which may explain why they died off. I'm always interested in how these groups fed themselves while they were having all these religious experiences. These guys early on sold garden seed, herbs, clothing, and eventually they started selling furniture. And you can look, what's the TV show that talks about auctions and stuff? You know what I'm talking about. What is it, the one where people are getting values on old stuff? What is the name of it? Anyway, if you can find Quaker furniture, it's worth a lot of money. It's worth big money. There's no new Quaker furniture. And it was really well made and really in demand. We'll start up next time talking about the Oneida community, another semi-religious group formed up in Vermont. We'll start talking about that next time around. Have an absolutely lovely rest of the day, folks. I think it's time for Mr. Hunt's nap. We are quitting early, aren't we?